The sugar crystallizes at 230 degrees. At that temperature, human skin blisters instantly, peels in sheets, and the screaming stops within 90 seconds as the throat scalds shut. The workers at Bellevue Plantation knew these facts the way farmers know rain, the way sailors know wind. They spent 16-hour shifts feeding cane stalks into grinding rollers, watching amber syrup thicken in copper vats that could hold 3 full barrels, breathing air so thick with burnt sugar it coated their lungs. They learned early, if you fell into a clarifier, no one could save you. The heat made rescue impossible. The syrup was worth more than any single life. On the morning of November 7th, 1833, the head refiner walked into the boiling house and smelled something wrong. Not burnt cane, not the usual copper penny tang of overheated metal. Something meaty and sweet together. Something that didn't belong. He found Madame Céleste Durand submerged to her shoulders in vat number 3. Her silk morning dress ballooned around her like a grotesque pastry. She'd been boiling for approximately 4 hours. Louisiana's German coast in 1833 produced more sugar than any other region in North America, but the arithmetic of that prosperity was written in suffering. A single hogshead of refined sugar required 16 hours of continuous labor by 6 people working in 100-degree heat. The profit margin on that hogshead was 32%. The mortality rate for enslaved people working sugar harvest was 3 times higher than for those in cotton or tobacco. These numbers appeared in ledgers and account books throughout St. Charles Parish, carefully recorded, rarely discussed in polite company. Bellevue Plantation sat 7 miles upriver from New Orleans, a middle-tier operation by local standards. 200 acres of cane, divided into plots with French precision. 68 enslaved people working the fields and refinery. 1 main house painted white with green shutters in the Creole style. 1 boiling house, built of brick with a slate roof to contain the heat. 1 chapel, where Father Thibodeau came twice monthly to bless the enterprise and remind everyone of their ordained places in God's design. The plantation belonged to Monsieur Armand Durand, though he spent most of his time in New Orleans attending to shipping contracts and mistresses. Day-to-day operations fell to his wife, Céleste. She'd been born Céleste Marchand, daughter of a prominent wine merchant from Bordeaux who'd come to Louisiana seeking opportunity. She married Armand in 1824, when she was 19 and he was 41. The marriage was practical rather than romantic. Her father needed business connections. Armand needed a wife who could manage a household and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about his evenings in the city. Céleste learned plantation management the way other women learned embroidery. She studied account books, memorized crop rotations, and developed a reputation for efficiency. She could calculate yield per acre in her head. She knew exactly how much rice and salt pork to provision weekly. She understood that sugar production required brutal precision. Any delay meant crystallization, spoilage, thousands of dollars lost. Under her management, Bellevue's output increased 14% in 5 years. What the account books didn't show was the method behind that efficiency. Marcus arrived at Bellevue Plantation on March 2nd, 1832, purchased at the New Orleans slave market for $850. He was 26 years old, 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands that marked him as valuable field labor. The bill of sale described him as Negro male, sound constitution, no visible defects, French-speaking. That last detail was what made him expensive. French-speaking enslaved people commanded premium prices in Louisiana. where plantation owners still conducted business in the language of the original settlers. Marcus had grown up on a plantation near Baton Rouge, where the previous owner had encouraged language education, believing it made workers more efficient. When that owner died in 1831, the estate was liquidated. Marcus's wife and 3 children went to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. He went to New Orleans, then to Bellevue. The separation happened on a Tuesday morning in January. Marcus remembered standing in the auction house, watching his wife Marie hold their youngest daughter, watching his sons try not to cry. The auctioneer sold them as a lot to a man from Natchez who needed field hands. Marcus sold separately because he brought a higher price alone. The mathematics of human commerce reduced 8 years of marriage to a line item. Female, age 24, 3 children, ages 3, 5, 7. $200 total. At Bellevue, Marcus worked the refinery. His French made him useful for translating Madame Durand's instructions to the other workers, many of whom spoke only English or African languages. His physical strength made him valuable for the heaviest work, lifting 100-pound sacks of raw sugar, operating the grinding machinery, tending the massive copper vats where cane juice boiled down to syrup. He shared a cabin with 5 other men in the quarters behind the main house. They slept on wooden platforms, ate rations of cornmeal and bacon fat, and woke before dawn to the overseer's bell. The work week ran Sunday afternoon through Saturday night during grinding season. In a good year, they'd get Christmas Day off. In a bad year, they worked straight through. Marcus didn't speak much about his family. The other men learned not to ask. Everyone in the quarters had lost someone. Wives sold, children gone, parents dead. Grief was currency you couldn't spend, so most people stored it away and tried to survive the present. But survival required submission, and Marcus discovered he was not built for submission. The first time Madame Durand struck him, Marcus was hauling a barrel of molasses from the storage shed to the refinery. It was late October, 1832, 8 months after his arrival. The barrel weighed 200 pounds, and the distance was roughly 50 yards across uneven ground. He'd made the trip dozens of times, balancing the barrel on his shoulder, moving carefully to avoid spilling. That afternoon, he stumbled. Just a moment of imbalance when his boot caught a root. The barrel slipped, hit the ground, cracked. Molasses poured into the dirt, thick and dark. Perhaps 3 gallons lost, maybe 4. Madame Durand was crossing the yard when it happened. She stopped, watched the spreading pool of syrup, and calculated the loss. At current market prices, 4 gallons represented approximately 2 days of Marcus's labor value. She didn't speak to him. She walked to the equipment shed and returned with a leather strap, the kind used for sharpening straight razors. Without preamble, she struck him across the face. Once, twice, 3 times. Hard enough to split the skin above his cheekbone. Hard enough that his ear rang for 2 days afterward. French speaking does not mean clumsy, she said, her own French crisp and cold. Do you understand? Yes, madame. Clean this mess. The barrel comes from your rations this week. She walked away, and Marcus knelt in the dirt, scooping molasses with his bare hands, tasting copper blood in his mouth. That was the first lesson. The mathematics were simple. The second lesson came in January 1833. A woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house, broke a porcelain serving dish. Not deliberately, she'd been carrying a tray of dishes from the dining room to the kitchen when she slipped on the polished floor. The dish fell, shattered. Madame Durand heard the crash from her study. What happened next took place in the front yard. where Madame Durand had Ruth stripped to the waist and whipped while the entire household watched. Not the overseer administering the punishment. Madame Durand did it herself. 20 lashes with a braided leather crop. Ruth's back opened in neat parallel lines. She made no sound after the first few strikes, just stood with her hands gripping the post they'd tied her to, breathing in short gasps. Marcus watched from the refinery door 60 yards away. He watched Madame Durand's face, the concentration there, the careful spacing of the blows. It wasn't rage, it was technique. The way you'd train a dog or prune a tree, systematic correction to produce desired behavior. When it was over, Madame Durand handed the crop to the overseer and returned to the house. Ruth was untied and sent to her cabin. No one spoke about it. That evening at rations, Ruth stood in line with her shirt sticking to her back, took her cornmeal and bacon, and went to eat alone. The third lesson came in stages throughout the spring and summer. Marcus learned that Madame Durand kept detailed records of every infraction, every mistake, every moment of perceived disobedience. She had a leather-bound book in her study where she recorded dates, descriptions, and punishments. She cross-referenced this book with her production ledgers, calculating the cost of each error against the value of each worker. A man named Joseph, who operated one of the grinding machines, lost 3 fingers in June when exhaustion made him careless. Madame Durand had the plantation's doctor, a white man who visited twice monthly, wrap the stumps and dose Joseph with laudanum for the pain. Then she docked his rations for 2 weeks to cover the cost of the medical care. A woman named Sarah gave birth in July and asked for 3 days to recover before returning to fieldwork. Madame Durand granted 1 day. When Sarah bled through her dress on the 2nd day and fainted, Madame Durand noted the lost labor time in her book and added it to Sarah's account, a fictional debt that Sarah would work off over the following months. Marcus absorbed these lessons. He learned to move with perfect care. He learned to anticipate Madame Durand's moods, to recognize the slight tightening around her mouth that signaled displeasure. He learned to make himself useful but not visible, productive but not prideful. But he also learned something else. Madame Durand had no fear. She walked among 68 people who had every reason to hate her, and she felt perfectly safe. She believed in the system that protected her. The law, the church, the network of white neighbors who would come running if anything threatened the established order. She believed these things made her untouchable. That belief was her final lesson to Marcus, though she never intended to teach it. November approached. The grinding season intensified. The cane had to be cut, processed, boiled, and crystallized before the first frost, which meant 20-hour workdays for everyone in the refinery. Marcus worked the vats, standing in 100-degree heat, stirring syrup that bubbled and spat. His hands were covered in burn scars. His lungs ached from breathing sugar-saturated air. And every morning, Madame Durand would tour the refinery, inspecting operations, checking temperatures, calculating yields. She'd stand beside the vats, so close Marcus could have reached out and touched her, and she'd never once hesitate. Never once seem to consider that boiling sugar could hurt her as easily as it hurt any of them. The thought came to Marcus slowly, like fog settling over water. Not all at once, but in pieces. Late-night pieces when he couldn't sleep for the pain in his hands. Dawn pieces when the bell dragged him from dreams of Marie and the children. The pieces accumulated, took shape, became a question. What if someone taught Madame Durand the lessons she'd been teaching them? What if someone showed her what it felt like to be powerless? What if? The grinding season reached its peak in early November. The refinery operated around the clock. crews rotating in 8-hour shifts. Marcus worked the night shift, midnight to 8 in the morning, when the darkness outside matched the darkness in the boiling house, and the only light came from the furnaces beneath the vats. November 7th began like every other morning. Marcus finished his shift as dawn broke, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the chill in the air. He'd been stirring vat number 3 since 2 in the morning, maintaining the precise temperature needed for crystallization. Too cool and the sugar would form lumps. Too hot and it would burn, turn black, become useless. He handed off to the day shift at 8, gave his report to the head refiner, a white man named Toussaint, who'd worked sugar his entire life, and walked toward the quarters for breakfast. That was the routine. 4 hours of rest, then back for the afternoon shift. But that morning, Marcus didn't go to the quarters. He waited behind the equipment shed, in the narrow space between the wall and a stack of empty barrels. He'd been watching Madame Durand's routine for weeks. She conducted her morning inspection of the refinery at 8:30, after the day shift had settled in, but before the heat became unbearable. She'd walk from the main house, through the yard, into the refinery, spend approximately 20 minutes checking operations, then return to the house for breakfast. She traveled this path alone, no overseer, no escort. Monsieur Durand was in New Orleans, as he was most weeks. The house servants were busy with breakfast. The field workers were already at their stations. For 20 minutes each morning, Madame Durand moved through a space where no one was paying close attention. Marcus had not planned this in the way someone plans a journey or a purchase. He'd simply observed, noted, filed away information. And that morning, as he stood behind the shed, he realized he'd made a decision without consciously choosing. His body had decided for him, or perhaps the accumulated weight of 19 months at Bellevue had decided. Or perhaps it was the memory of Marie's face as they pulled her away at the auction house. Motivation has its own mathematics, too complicated for ledgers. Across the yard, the chapel bell rang. At 8:28, Madame Durand emerged from the main house. She wore a silk dress the color of cream, with lace at the collar and sleeves. Her dark hair was pinned up in the fashion of the day. She carried a small notebook and pencil for recording observations. She walked with the posture of someone who'd never had to hurry, never had to watch where she stepped, for fear of punishment. Marcus waited until she passed the shed, then stepped out behind her. His heart was remarkably calm. No pounding, no rush of blood, just a steady, almost mechanical rhythm. His hands, scarred from months of burns, hung loose at his sides. "Madame." She turned, mildly surprised to see him there. "Marcus, you should be resting. I need to show you something in the refinery. There's a problem with Vat 3. Her expression shifted to concern, not for him, but for the equipment, the production, the money. "What kind of problem?" "The temperature gauge is reading wrong. I'm worried we'll lose the batch." She glanced toward the refinery, calculating. A full vat represented approximately $600 of raw product. If the crystallization failed, it would have to be reprocessed, which meant lost time, lost fuel, lost profit. "Show me." He led her toward the refinery. The building was brick, 30 feet long by 20 feet wide, with a slate roof and windows near the ceiling for ventilation. Inside, 3 massive copper vats sat over brick furnaces. The day shift workers, 2 men tending the fires, 1 operating the grinder, 1 skimming impurities, barely looked up as Madame Durand entered. Her presence was routine. She was always checking something, measuring something, recording something. Marcus walked her to Vat 3, the one he'd been working all night. The syrup inside was golden brown, thick as honey, bubbling gently. Steam rose in wispy columns. The surface temperature was 230 degrees, measured by the gauge on the side. "I don't see a problem," Madame Durand said, checking the gauge herself. "It's the reading," Marcus said. "Watch." He picked up the long wooden paddle used for stirring and tapped it against the gauge. Nothing happened. Madame Durand leaned closer to examine it, and Marcus moved behind her, and in that moment, that single breath between intention and action, the world narrowed to one simple fact. She was within reach, and he was stronger, and 23 months of accumulated lessons demanded their conclusion. What happened in the refinery over the next 90 seconds would be debated for weeks, reconstructed from contradictory accounts, shaped by the agendas of those doing the telling. But certain physical facts remained indisputable, recorded in documents that still exist in the St. Charles Parish courthouse. Madame Durand's dress was silk. When Marcus grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms, the fabric tore easily. She fought. The bruising on Marcus's forearms would later be documented. But he outweighed her by 80 pounds and had the strength of someone who'd spent 2 years doing physical labor that broke most men in 5. He forced her to her knees beside Vat 3. Rope used for securing barrels hung on hooks along the wall. He bound her wrists to the vat's iron frame, positioned her so she was bent forward, her face inches from the bubbling surface. The heat alone at that distance would have been painful. 140 degrees radiating up from the syrup. The day shift workers had stopped their tasks. 3 men stood frozen, watching, their minds trying to process what they were seeing. Revolutionary acts look different when they're happening in front of you. Not heroic or grand, but shocking, impossible, world-ending. "Get out," Marcus told them in French. Then in English, "Go, now." They ran, not toward the main house to raise an alarm, but toward the quarters, toward anywhere that wasn't there, because what was happening violated every social law they'd lived under, and they didn't know which was more dangerous, staying to witness or fleeing to survive. Madame Durand was screaming, short, sharp cries that echoed off the brick walls. "Marcus, please, whatever you want, Do you remember Ruth?" His voice was calm, conversational almost. "January, the serving dish. I don't 20 lashes, I counted." "Marcus, listen to me. Do you remember Joseph?" "June, 3 fingers. You charged him for the doctor." It was necessary." "Do you remember Marie? My wife, my children, sold because your husband needed money for his mistress in New Orleans." She'd stopped screaming, started crying instead, desperate, breathless sobs. "I didn't sell them. That was Monsieur Durand's decision. I had nothing to do with—" "You had everything to do with it. You run this plantation. You decide who gets punished, who gets sold, who lives and who dies. You tell me I'm clumsy. You tell Ruth she's careless. You tell Joseph he's expensive. But you're the one who decides all of it." He picked up the paddle again. The end was dark with crystallized sugar, hardened by months of use. He used it to push her head down, closer to the surface, close enough that the steam would have been scalding her face. "Please," she gasped. "Please, I have money. I can pay you. I can free you." "You can't free anyone. You're just a woman with a ledger." What happened next was not sudden. Marcus took his time, perhaps 90 seconds, lowering her by degrees into the vat. First her face broke the surface, then her shoulders. The syrup was viscous enough that she couldn't sink immediately. It resisted, held her suspended like an insect in amber. Her screaming stopped after the first full submersion, replaced by something more animal, more fundamental. Marcus held her under until the thrashing slowed, then stopped. Then he released the ropes binding her wrists to the frame, and her body, lighter than the sugar, sank slowly into the vat. Toussaint, the head refiner, found her at noon. He'd returned from the main house, where he'd been discussing equipment repairs with the overseer, and noticed the day shift workers huddled outside the refinery, refusing to go back in. When he demanded an explanation, they said only, "Something happened. We don't know. We left." He entered the refinery alone. The furnaces were still burning beneath the vats. The temperature inside was perhaps 115 degrees. The smell hit him first. That meaty sweetness, the wrongness of it. He walked to Vat 3, looked in, and saw what would be described in subsequent documents as the remains of a white woman partially submerged in a state incompatible with survival. Toussaint ran to the main house. The overseer, a man named Graves, sent riders immediately to the neighboring plantations. In 1833, Louisiana, the murder of a white woman by an enslaved person wasn't just a crime. It was a rupture in the social order, a crack in the foundation that held up the entire economy. If one enslaved person could kill their owner and escape, then the system itself was at risk. Within 2 hours, 30 men on horseback had assembled at Bellevue. They brought dogs, guns, and the casual certainty that comes from believing justice and revenge are the same thing. They searched the quarters, the fields, the woods along the river. They questioned every enslaved person on the property, using the methods men used when they believed brutality would yield truth faster than patience. But Marcus was already gone. No one saw him leave. Or rather, people saw him leave, but no one said anything. After he walked out of the refinery that morning, he'd returned to his cabin, gathered the few possessions he owned, a spare shirt, a tin cup, a small knife, and walked toward the river. He passed Ruth hanging laundry. He passed Joseph sitting on his cabin steps, his 3-fingered hand resting on his knee. He passed Sarah nursing her baby in the doorway. None of them spoke to him. None of them raised an alarm. They watched him go with the kind of careful non-expression that enslaved people had perfected over centuries of survival. Later, when questioned, they would say, "I didn't see Marcus that morning. I was working. I don't know where he went." The mathematics of complicity are rarely recorded in ledgers. News of Madame Durand's death spread through St. Charles Parish like smoke from a cane fire. By evening on November 7th, every plantation owner within 20 miles knew that Céleste Durand had been murdered by one of her enslaved workers. By the following morning, the story had reached New Orleans, where it appeared in the Daily Picayune under the headline, "Brutal Murder on German Coast." The article did not mention Madame Durand by name. Propriety demanded discretion, but described a respectable plantation mistress, known for her piety and efficiency, who had been most foully killed by a Negro man of violent temperament. The piece went on to speculate about dangerous influences from the North and the consequences of excessive leniency in plantation management. Monsieur Armand Durand returned from New Orleans on November 8th, traveling upriver by steamboat. He arrived at Bellevue to find his house full of neighbors and clergy, all offering condolences and advice. The advice was unanimous. Make an example. Find Marcus and execute him publicly, in a manner visible enough to remind every enslaved person in the parish what happened to those who forgot their place. Father Thibodeau, the priest who'd blessed Bellevue's chapel, led a prayer service that evening. 50 people attended, plantation owners and their families, overseers, free people of color, who owned small plots nearby. They prayed for Madame Durand's soul and for the preservation of order. They did not pray for Marcus, except insofar as they prayed he would be caught quickly. After the service, the men gathered in Monsieur Durand's study to coordinate the search. Maps were spread across the desk. Each plantation in the area was marked, along with swamps, rivers, and roads. They discussed likely routes. Would Marcus head toward New Orleans and try to blend into the city's population of free people of color? Or would he go north toward Baton Rouge, or west into the backcountry? He speaks French, one neighbor noted. That makes him easier to spot if he runs. Unless he runs to French territory, another replied. Plenty of places in the bayou where people don't ask questions. Judge Reinhardt Auclair, who presided over the parish court, offered a reward. $500 for Marcus's capture, alive or dead. He also authorized the formation of a patrol, 20 men who would search systematically, checking every cabin, every church, every place an escaped man might hide or find help. What none of these men acknowledged, though all of them felt it, was the fear. Not fear of Marcus specifically, but fear of what his action represented. If one enslaved person could kill their owner, others might try. If the system could fail at a well-run plantation like Bellevue, it could fail anywhere. The entire economy of southern Louisiana rested on the assumption that control was absolute. Marcus had proven it wasn't. That fear drove the search's intensity. The patrol worked methodically through the following days, questioning not just enslaved people but free people of color, poor whites, anyone who might have aided an escaped man. They used tactics that ranged from intimidation to violence, justified by the urgency of their mission. A Baptist minister 20 miles north reported that a man matching Marcus's description had come to his church seeking food. The patrol arrived within hours, burned the church, and arrested the minister on suspicion of harboring a fugitive. He was released after 2 days when his congregation, all white, vouched for his character and claimed he'd reported the incident immediately. A free woman of color in a settlement near the river mentioned seeing a man walking the road at dawn on November 8th. The patrol questioned her for 3 hours, demanded to search her house, and threatened prosecution for aiding an escape. She eventually recanted, saying she'd been mistaken. It was probably just a neighbor. By November 12th, 6 days after Madame Durand's death, the patrol had found no trace of Marcus. Judge Auclair increased the reward to $1,000, more than Marcus's purchase price, and authorized the use of bloodhounds purchased from a neighboring parish. The dogs picked up a scent near the river, followed it into the Yaona cypress swamps south of the plantation, then lost it where the ground turned to standing water. Either Marcus had waded through miles of swamp, or he'd found a boat, or he'd simply vanished. Rumors began to circulate. Someone claimed to have seen Marcus boarding a steamboat headed to Texas. Someone else swore he'd joined a community of Maroons, escaped enslaved people living in the deep swamp, beyond the reach of white authority. A third person suggested he'd been killed by someone hoping to claim the reward, but unable to produce a body. The official search lasted 2 weeks. Then, on November 21st, Judge Auclair declared Marcus a fugitive and issued a standing warrant for his arrest. The reward remained posted, but the active patrol disbanded. The men had plantations to run, crops to harvest, lives to return to. Marcus had disappeared, and while his absence remained unsettling, the grinding season didn't wait for closure. The St. Charles Parish Courthouse holds 3 boxes of documents related to the death of Céleste Durand and the subsequent investigation. Most are routine, witness statements, reward postings, correspondence between Judge Auclair and law enforcement in neighboring parishes. But buried in these papers is a letter that changes how we understand what happened at Bellevue. The letter was written by Ruth, the woman Madame Durand had whipped in January. It's dated December 3rd, 1833, addressed to Father Thibodeau, and was never delivered. Instead, it was found among Ruth's possessions when she died of fever 3 months later. Her cabin mate gave it to the overseer, who filed it with other plantation records, where it sat unread for over a century. December 3rd, 1833, from the effects of Ruth, deceased, Bellevue Plantation. Father, I write to confess what I cannot speak aloud. You ask us in confession if we have sinned. I have, not by action, but by silence. The morning Madame died, I saw Marcus leave the refinery. I saw the look on his face, not rage, not fear, just emptiness. I knew what he had done before anyone found her, and I said nothing. I could have raised an alarm. I could have told Mr. Graves. Instead, I finished hanging laundry and went about my day. When they questioned me, I said I saw nothing. I lied to men who could have hanged me for lying, because whatever Marcus did to Madame, she had done worse to us for years. You tell us to forgive those who trespass against us, but you never tell us what to do when trespass is the law itself. When the people we're supposed to forgive own us, beat us, sell our children. How do we forgive that? How do we forgive and still survive? I don't know if Marcus is alive or dead. Part of me hopes he made it somewhere safe. Part of me hopes Madame's soul is burning in hell. And I know that makes me a sinner too. But if silence makes me guilty of murder, then so be it. I'm guilty. We're all guilty. Because every one of us who saw Marcus that morning chose to let him go. The letter reveals something the official investigation missed. The enslaved community at Bellevue made a collective choice. They knew what had happened, knew Marcus was responsible, and decided his life mattered more than their own safety. Every person who was questioned and said, "I saw nothing," understood they were risking brutal punishment if caught lying. They did it anyway. This wasn't passive resistance or simple fear. It was active conspiracy, coordinated without planning, executed with the kind of silent consensus that comes from shared suffering. 68 people kept the same secret for weeks, knowing that one person breaking could mean mass punishment for everyone. The question isn't why they protected Marcus. The question is, what kind of conditions create solidarity strong enough that people will risk everything to protect someone who just committed murder? The parish never found an answer. Monsieur Armand Durand buried his wife on November 9th in the cemetery behind Bellevue's chapel. Father Thibodeau conducted the service for a small group: family, neighbors, the overseer. The enslaved population was not permitted to attend, though they could hear the hymns from the quarters. The burial presented logistical challenges. What remained of Céleste Durand, after 4 hours in boiling sugar, was not suitable for an open casket. The undertaker did his best, but ultimately the coffin was sealed, and mourners were discouraged from viewing the body. The official cause of death, recorded in parish records, was listed as murder by immersion. The details were not elaborated. After the funeral, Armand faced a different kind of reckoning. Bellevue was now his alone to manage, and he discovered quickly that he had no talent for it. Céleste had kept detailed records of everything: planting schedules, equipment maintenance, worker assignments, financial accounts. Armand had ignored all of it, content to collect profits while his wife handled the practical work. Without her, the plantation began to falter. The grinding season, which should have continued through December, slowed to a halt by late November. The workers, unsupervised and unmotivated, did the minimum required to avoid punishment. The refinery operated at half capacity. The cane in the fields rotted before it could be harvested. By January, Armand had decided to sell. He couldn't manage the property, couldn't bear to live in the house where his wife had been killed, couldn't look at the refinery without smelling burnt sugar and meat. He listed Bellevue for sale in February, pricing it at $25,000. Land, equipment, and 68 enslaved people included. The sale took 4 months. Potential buyers toured the property, examined the books, made offers. Everyone knew what had happened here, and that knowledge lowered the price. No one wanted to buy a plantation with that kind of history, that kind of stain. Eventually, a buyer from Texas agreed to purchase for $18,000, a 30% loss, and Armand took the money and moved back to France, where he died in 1841 of liver failure, aged 58. But the violence didn't end with the sale. In April of 1834, 5 months after Madame Durand's death, a woman named Agnes was whipped to death at a plantation 12 miles south of Bellevue. The reason? She'd been caught teaching 2 children to read. The overseer who killed her claimed she was spreading dangerous ideas and setting a bad example in the wake of recent troubles. In June, a man named Solomon tried to escape from a plantation near the river. He made it 15 miles before being caught. Instead of the usual punishment, a flogging and confinement, the owner had him hanged publicly at a crossroads, his body left to rot as a warning. The official explanation: zero tolerance after the Durand incident. In August, St. Charles Parish passed new restrictions on the movement of enslaved people. No travel between plantations without written permission. Mandatory inspections of quarters every Sunday. Increased penalties for any white person suspected of aiding an escape. The parish council justified these measures as necessary security. What they didn't say, but everyone understood, was that Marcus's disappearance had terrified them. If he could kill and escape, others might try. The system was only as strong as its weakest link, and he'd proven that even well-managed plantations could fail. Over the following year, 2 more enslaved people were killed during attempted escapes in St. Charles Parish. 3 more were sold to plantations further south as punishment for minor infractions that, pre-Durand, would have resulted in flogging at most. The violence rippled outward, touching lives far beyond Bellevue. This is the price of resistance. Not just the punishment of those who resist, but the collective punishment of everyone who might someday consider it. Marcus was never captured, which meant he was never tried, which meant there was never a legal proceeding to document what happened and why. But in March of 1834, Judge Auclair convened what he called an investigative tribunal. Not a trial, but a formal inquiry designed to establish facts, identify failures in plantation security, and provide recommendations. The tribunal lasted 3 days. Witnesses included Monsieur Durand, the overseer Graves, several neighbors, Toussaint, the head refiner, and 5 enslaved people from Bellevue who were questioned under oath. The proceedings took place in the parish courthouse, with a stenographer recording testimony that now fills 62 pages of archived documents. The enslaved witnesses were questioned separately, with the explicit threat that any lies would result in immediate punishment. They were asked, had Marcus shown signs of discontent? Had he discussed plans to escape or commit violence? Had anyone aided him after the murder? Their answers were remarkably consistent. No, no, no. Ruth testified that Marcus kept to himself and never spoke about Madame except when required. Joseph said Marcus was a good worker who followed instructions. Sarah claimed she barely knew him, as he worked different hours. Each witness presented the same picture. Marcus was unremarkable, quiet, gave no indication he was planning anything. Either they were lying with perfect coordination, or Marcus had genuinely kept his intentions hidden from everyone. The tribunal concluded it was the latter, though several judges privately suspected the former. Either way, the testimony revealed nothing useful about where Marcus might have gone or who might have helped him. The tribunal's final report, issued April 2, 1834, concluded that the murder was an aberration committed by an individual of defective character, rather than evidence of broader unrest. It recommended improved security measures, better supervision, stricter controls on movement, regular inspections, but insisted the system itself was sound. The report also noted, almost as an afterthought, that Madame Durand had been perhaps overzealous in her discipline, and suggested that plantation owners should exercise their authority with firmness, but avoid excessive harshness that might provoke resentment. This recommendation went nowhere. In 1833 Louisiana, the idea that cruelty might cause resistance was too dangerous to take seriously. If enslaved people could only be controlled through violence, then limiting violence meant weakening control. The system couldn't survive that kind of moderation. What would you do sitting in that courthouse gallery, listening to those testimonies? Would you believe the witnesses, or would you assume they were lying? Would you see a system failing, or a system working exactly as designed? These weren't rhetorical questions for the white people of St. Charles Parish. Their lives, their wealth, their entire social order depended on the answers. Most chose to believe the tribunal's conclusion. Marcus was an aberration. The system was fine. The violence could continue. In July of 1834, 8 months after the murder, a lawyer settling Armand Durand's debts discovered something in the study at Bellevue. It was a second set of books, hidden in a false bottom of the desk, where Céleste had kept her official accounts. These books contained records that Céleste had never shared with her husband, never reported to their banker, never included in any official accounting. The lawyer, whose name was Mercier, brought them to Judge Auclair. The two men spent an afternoon reading, and what they found was a systematic documentation of cruelty that went beyond anything revealed during the tribunal. Céleste had recorded every punishment she'd administered over 9 years, along with detailed notes on methods and effectiveness. She'd developed a ranking system for enslaved people, categorizing them by productivity, obedience, and what she called correction resistance, how much punishment was required to ensure compliance. She'd calculated the optimal frequency of flogging, once every 3 weeks per worker on average. The maximum blood loss before productivity declined, approximately 1 pint. The recovery time needed after severe punishment, 2 to 4 days. She'd also kept financial records that revealed something darker. Several enslaved people had died under suspicious circumstances, and Céleste had falsified the causes. A man who died from an infection after being whipped too severely was recorded as fever, natural causes. A woman who committed suicide after her children were sold was listed as accident during fieldwork. A child who died from malnutrition was attributed to weak constitution. These falsifications weren't just cover-ups. They were calculated business decisions. If Céleste had reported the true causes, she would have faced questions about her management. Better to claim natural deaths than admit the plantation was killing its workers faster than they could be replaced. The ledgers also revealed financial information that changed the tribunal's conclusions. Bellevue hadn't been as profitable as everyone assumed. Céleste had been inflating numbers in her official books, making the plantation appear successful while actually losing money. The cruelty wasn't about maintaining productivity. It was about hiding failure through terror. Judge Auclair faced a decision: make these ledgers public and destroy Céleste's reputation, or suppress them and preserve the fiction that she'd been a respectable woman killed by a violent man. He chose suppression. The ledgers were sealed, marked as sensitive financial documents, and locked in a courthouse vault, where they remained until 1897, when a researcher studying Louisiana plantation economics found them by accident. By then, both Durand and Auclair were long dead, and the information couldn't hurt anyone's reputation. But it did change the historical record. The woman who'd been memorialized as a tragic victim was revealed as a systematic torturer. The man who'd been demonized as a brutal killer was shown to have had reasons that went beyond defective character. The ledgers didn't justify murder. Nothing justifies murder. But they explained it, provided context, showed the slow accumulation of cruelty that had driven Marcus to an act of desperate violence. And they raised a question that no one in 1834 wanted to answer. How many other plantations had similar ledgers hidden in their desks? Marcus was seen twice after leaving Bellevue, though neither sighting was confirmed with certainty. The first came in January of 1835, 14 months after the murder. A steamboat captain traveling from New Orleans to Natchez reported seeing a man matching Marcus's description working as a deckhand on a rival vessel. The captain notified authorities in Natchez, who investigated and found nothing. No record of a worker named Marcus. No one matching the description. The second sighting was in May of 1837. A Catholic priest in Mobile, Alabama, mentioned during confession that a man had come to his church seeking sanctuary. The man spoke French, had burned scars on his hands, and carried a deep guilt about something he wouldn't specify. The priest, bound by the seal of confession, couldn't reveal details, but he mentioned the incident in a letter to a colleague that was later intercepted by law enforcement. By the time authorities reached Mobile, the man was gone. The priest claimed he'd helped him travel further west, toward Texas, but provided no specifics. Whether this was Marcus or someone else was never determined. These two possible sightings are all the documentary record contains. After May of 1837, Marcus vanished completely from the historical archive. No court records, no newspaper mentions, no letters or journals or legal documents. He became, in official terms, a disappeared person, someone who'd existed, committed a notable act, then ceased to exist as far as the law was concerned. But oral history tells a different story. Among the descendant communities of enslaved people in Louisiana, a legend persists. The man who killed the mistress in the sugar vats escaped to Mexico, where he lived to old age under an assumed name. Some versions of the story say he became a blacksmith. Others claim he worked on a ranch. A few suggest he joined a community of free black people in Veracruz and never spoke of his past. None of these stories can be verified, but they share certain details that suggest a common source. The man had burn scars on his hands, spoke both French and English, and never married because he'd lost his family to slavery. In 1892, a researcher collecting oral histories in southern Louisiana interviewed a woman named Josephine, age 87, who claimed her grandmother had known Marcus at Bellevue. According to Josephine, her grandmother said Marcus had come back once, years after the murder, disguised as a traveling preacher. He'd spoken at a small church in the quarters on a Sunday evening, then left before dawn. The sermon was about Exodus, the Israelites escaping slavery, Pharaoh's army drowning in the sea. My grandmother said everyone knew it was him, Josephine told the researcher. But no one said nothing. He was safe because we kept him safe. Whether this story is true or wishful mythology is impossible to determine, but it reveals something important about how the black community remembered Marcus. Not as a criminal or a victim, but as someone who'd struck back, someone who'd proven that the system wasn't invincible, someone who'd survived. In the white community, Marcus was remembered differently. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient discipline, the consequences of trusting enslaved people, the need for constant vigilance. Plantation owners would reference the Durand incident when justifying harsh punishments or stricter controls. He was proof that the system required violence to function. Both memories are real. Both shaped how people understood slavery, resistance, and the moral calculations required to survive in a world built on human cruelty. The plantation that became Bellevue after the sale in 1834 bore little resemblance to what had existed under the Durands. The new owner, a man named Charles Fontaine from Houston, had no interest in sugar. He converted the fields to cotton, demolished the refinery, and sold the copper vats for scrap. The building where Céleste Durand had died was torn down brick by brick until nothing remained but a patch of bare ground that wouldn't grow anything for years. The enslaved people who'd lived at Bellevue were dispersed. Fontaine kept about half for cotton work and sold the rest to other plantations. Ruth went to a rice plantation near the coast. Joseph was sold to a sugar operation in Terrebonne Parish. Sarah went to Mississippi. The community that had maintained their collective silence about Marcus's escape was broken apart. Scattered across the South, their conspiracy dissolved by the logic of commerce. Fontaine renamed the property Willowbrook and ran it with more typical brutality. Regular but not excessive, efficient but not sadistic. He was neither kind nor cruel by the standards of his time, which meant he beat people when they didn't work fast enough and sold them when he needed cash. By 1863, when Union forces occupied the area during the Civil War, Willowbrook had 72 enslaved people and an annual cotton yield that placed it in the middle tier of Louisiana plantations. The land itself bears scars that are visible if you know where to look. Where the refinery stood, the soil is darker than the surrounding ground, enriched by decades of spilled sugar and ash. Archaeologists who surveyed the site in 1998 found fragments of copper, iron stanchions, and a layer of crystallized sugar mixed with earth. They also found something else, small carved marks on some of the bricks, patterns that might have been decorative or might have been a kind of record-keeping by the people who worked there. One of those marks, 3 parallel lines crossed by a single slash, appears on bricks at 7 other plantation sites across Louisiana. Historians have theorized it might have been a sign used by enslaved people to mark places where violence had occurred, a silent monument to suffering that their owners couldn't see or decipher. If true, it means Marcus wasn't the only one keeping records. While Céleste Durand documented cruelty in her hidden ledgers, the people she brutalized were documenting it too, in a language she couldn't read, on surfaces she never examined. They were writing their own history in brick and stone and wood, ensuring that someday, somehow, someone would know what had happened here. In 2006, a graduate student at Louisiana State University named Tamara Williams published her dissertation on resistance and violence in antebellum sugar plantations. She'd spent 3 years researching court records, plantation journals, and oral histories, trying to understand how enslaved people navigated the impossible choice between submission and rebellion. Her work included a detailed examination of the Durand case, pulling together documents that had been scattered across archives for over a century. She found Celeste's hidden ledgers, Ruth's letter, the tribunal testimony, and dozens of other fragments. She traced the subsequent lives of Bellevue's enslaved population as far as the records allowed. She mapped the ripple effects of Marcus's action, the increased violence, the tightened restrictions, the fear that spread through both black and white communities. Her conclusion was uncomfortable for everyone. Marcus's act of violence had made things worse for most enslaved people in St. Charles Parish. The system had responded to his resistance by becoming more brutal, more restrictive, more paranoid. His escape had demonstrated that rebellion was possible, but the backlash had demonstrated that the cost of rebellion would be collective punishment. So was Marcus justified? Williams refused to answer directly, writing instead, "Justice in the context of slavery is a broken concept. The law protected slave owners and criminalized enslaved people. The courts that would have tried Marcus for murder saw no crime in the systematic torture he endured. To ask whether his action was just is to pretend there was a legal or moral framework that could have delivered justice through legitimate means. There wasn't. The question isn't whether Marcus was justified. It's whether we can acknowledge that sometimes the only response to absolute power is absolute resistance, even when that resistance comes at a terrible cost." The dissertation won academic awards and sparked controversy. Some scholars praised Williams for her unflinching analysis. Others accused her of romanticizing violence and ignoring the harm Marcus's action caused to other enslaved people who suffered the backlash. Both sides agreed on one thing: the case still matters, still raises questions about resistance, complicity, and the moral calculations people make when trapped in immoral systems. In 2011, a group of descendant families, people who could trace their ancestry to Bellevue's enslaved population, placed a historical marker at the site of the former plantation. The marker doesn't mention Marcus by name, but it acknowledges what happened there. On this site stood Bellevue Plantation, where 68 people were held in slavery from 1824 to 1834. Here they worked, suffered, and resisted. Here they maintained community in the face of cruelty. Here they made choices about survival and solidarity that echo through their descendants today. This marker honors their memory and acknowledges that the full truth of their lives remains partially unrecorded. The marker was vandalized twice in its first year, once with spray paint, once with a sledgehammer. Each time, it was repaired and reinstalled. The local historical society now maintains it with security cameras and regular inspections. Some truths are stubborn. They refuse to stay buried. The sugar vats at Bellevue were sold for scrap in 1835 and melted down to make new copper products: kettles, piping, roofing material. That metal is now spread across Louisiana, incorporated into buildings and equipment that have no connection to what they were before. You might eat food prepared in a pot that was once part of the vat where Céleste Durand died, and you'd never know. But the story persists. In New Orleans, in the neighborhoods where descendants of enslaved people built communities after emancipation, there's a folk saying that gets repeated when someone asks about resistance or revenge. The sugar remembers. It's cryptic to outsiders, but clear to those who know the history. It means that violence leaves marks that can't be scrubbed away. It means that cruelty has consequences that accumulate over time. It means that sometimes the powerless find power in ways the powerful never anticipate. Marcus was never found, never tried, never executed. His fate remains unknown, which means he exists in that liminal space between history and legend. He might have died in the swamp days after escaping. He might have lived to old age in Mexico. He might have been the preacher who returned to give that sermon about Exodus. All of those possibilities coexist in the absence of proof. What's certain is that he changed something, not the system of slavery that continued for another 30 years, but the psychology of it. He proved that the barrier between owner and owned was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. He demonstrated that cruelty could be answered with cruelty, that the tools of violence could turn in unexpected directions. And he left a question that Louisiana is still trying to answer. What happens when the oppressed stop accepting their oppression? What happens when someone decides that dying free is better than living enslaved? What happens when the sugar boils over? On humid November mornings in St. Charles Parish, when the air is thick with moisture and the smell of industry, old-timers sometimes claim they can still smell it. That sweet meat wrongness that clung to Bellevue Plantation in 1833. They'll tell you it's just the refineries upriver, just the factories processing sugarcane the way they have for 2 centuries. But they'll also tell you that land remembers, that violence leaves traces that don't fade, that some stories refuse to end. The story of Marcus and Madame Durand lives in courthouse documents and oral histories, in academic dissertations and folk sayings, in historical markers and grandmother's warnings. It lives because it asks questions we haven't finished answering about power and resistance, about cruelty and consequence, about what it costs to fight back against a system built to crush you. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.